Thanks very much. My first and only appearance on Laurie Oakes' Sunday show, where I thought I'd talk about Aboriginal affairs, and he discovered a weakness in me because I wasn't allowed by the leadership to say certain things on native title. So I slipped up on one word and he was into me for about 10 minutes. It's the most brutal television you've ever seen. But I kept saying, Laurie, trying to get a bit of a breath so that I could come back at him. 22 Lauries later, the interview got back on the rails. We go into question time, and I knew I was going to cop it, and sure enough, Dorothy Dixon from John Howard saying how all you could say was Laurie. And I've shot straight back because I'd learnt from Gough Whitlam, you've got to premeditate these situations. So as he said, no sooner had Laurie come out of his mouth and people were laughing, because there's nothing like when you're in a bit of trouble, even your colleagues will laugh again at you. I came back straight away and said, why don't you say sorry? And the whole place erupted and he shut up and we moved on. It just shows that, look, Keating was like that, you know, you're never dead till you're dead. You can always come back with a punch. Look, I wanted to share some reflections of my time as a backbencher and as a shadow minister in relation to Aboriginal affairs, and I think it's important for people to know what makes you do things and what's motivated you. So I've had a bit of time to reflect, and I'm really pleased that my friend Laurie Brereton is here with his wife Trish Kavanagh and the kids and grandkids, because one of the things you need is a good mob that you can put your head on their shoulders, and Laurie was a supporter, as was people like Jerry Hand, Warren Snowden, Nick Bolkus, and through the period you draw strength, because you can't do this stuff on your own. The other thing that I had that no one else had for 23 years was a team of private lawyers who I'd known when I became a legal aid solicitor and barrister, who helped me on a whole series of issues, not just to do with native title, and I'll reflect on some of them. You know, free advice. Even Alex Shand, God rest his soul, when he was alive, gave a $30,000 free advice to do with the race power. And the bar is very generous when you ask them. But the advice I acted upon was as follows. Having just been appointed shadow minister, and I was pretty happy with myself, my mate Tracker Tillmouth said to me in pretty clear terms, Mel, we don't want to be saved by you. In other words, you act in a particular way. Jerry Hand's advice was box clever. And the third bit of advice that armed me and still arms me today, because I've gone to some websites, but I went to the Fred Hollows website and I saw a statistic that's still with us today and is a shame of this nation. 24% of Aboriginal men live till the age of 65 and 35% of Aboriginal women. Why do Aboriginal women and men have to ask for assistance that is given in all the suburbs around Australia, that if it wasn't given, there'd be an uproar? But with statistics like that, there's an obligation, especially since the 67 referendum, for the National Parliament to protect its Indigenous citizens. So they're the sort of things that made me passionate, just nice and simple, and guided me all the way through. Now, as a backbencher, the first thing I saw ushered in was the ATSIC in 1990. Unfortunately, it was abolished in 2004. The Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, 1991. Positive stuff. And then it went belly up with the Mabo decision and the introduction of the Native Title Act, which just saw the Parliament go feral. And Keating, to his credit, was month after month trying to reach an agreement. But he was actually getting some bad advice. He was being told by his lawyers that they had to technically suspend the Racial Discrimination Act to overcome what they thought was a lack of procedural fairness for titles that had been issued post-75 to the Racial Discrimination Act. Now, I fortunately went to a couple of mates of mine, Michael Finane QC, and the latter one was Greg James QC, and got some decent advice that basically said retrospective procedural fairness was bunkum. Indeed, the Chief Justice of the High Court, on the day I rang this lawyer who'd been in the High Court, and said retrospective procedural fairness can't be achieved. It's got to be prospective. It's got to be done in other ways. And we used that High Court case. Anyway, Keating, to his eternal credit, grabbed this advice like a hungry dog and went all the way through the Act. And I think Marcy was part of the A-team. We had that Black Friday where we all had given up. And I'd gone home and I hadn't given up. And it turned around in a matter of days. And I think Ruby Tuesday, the balance was there. And no one was happier than Paul Keating. And what he found out was the only people who weren't misleading him or weren't fibbing to him were the blacks. And that's why he kept the question of whether a pastoralist extinguished native title to the courts to decide. And that was critical, because if they'd have legislated, then there would have been bucketfuls of extinguishment that Tim Fisher would have just dreamed of. And I went and had a look at what's happened on native title. In December 2009, I had a map from the National Native Title Tribunal that showed 963,000 square metres had been recognised. 30th of June 14, 1,946,000 recognised. In the space of 4.5 years, over another million. Now, it's just bubbling through the system, but you're not hearing West Australia complain now. Conservative governments are copying it on the chin. And what I found always in my advocacy on Aboriginal issues, everyone wanted Aboriginal people to give way. The courts would recognise them. No, give way. You know, let's suspend the Racial Discrimination Act. And I heard about rights earlier. You're not going to get the Constitution changed on rights. You're kidding yourself. I'm a pessimist. But the Racial Discrimination Act is the Bill of Rights that has allowed Aboriginal people to go to court in the original Mabo cases, to defeat Joe Bjelke-Petersen's attempts to, grab the land, and on a whole series of things. What I got frightened of, the case that frightened me, was the Hindmarsh Island Bridge case, because there's some judges in there that talk about the positive referendum that we all thought in '67 achieved positive ability to reform for Aboriginal people. If there was a proper determination on a particular case, they would more than likely find that it adopted the policies of 1901, which that provision was first enacted. And that is a very dangerous precedent that might allow negative things to be done by government to Aborigines, because it picks up the race power, what happens with aliens and all that, same thing. So need to get the real question mark, do we need to change the racist power to ensure that it can only be positive? That's the real issue. That's the real issue, because that sleeper is still there. And you've only got to read the judgments. Now look, I'm going to be very quick. Century Zinc in '96 came to us. I got told, go and meet them. That Rio Tinto. We got $1 billion mine. We've discussed it. We've negotiated in good faith outside the Native Title Act, but we want special exemption. They sought it from the feds in the States. I said, forget about it. And they accepted that advice. I said, go away, negotiate within the Native Title Act, you'll have a title within 12 months. They got it within 11. And the goodwill that Rio Tinto showed in not persisting, I can tell you the then Queensland Premier and Howard were spitting chips, because it was all about wedging. But Rio Tinto reaped the rewards because they respected Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people responded in terms of inviting them onto their land. I think that's a classic example. The ATSIC budget cuts, which in 1996, $470 million. This is what they terminated. 67 million off the community training program. The community and youth support program, 101 million. Terminated planned expansion of CDEP, 55 million. Cuts to community housing and infrastructure, 80 million. We've seen a repeat of it recently. And some are calling for more cuts to show they're hairy-chested. Give us a break. The Native Title Amendment Bill, which was the Wick case, we fought it. Probably the best debate in the Parliament from an opposition in history. 400 pages of amendments. We responded with 300 amendments. 100 of those were actually picked up by the government because they were procedural. We had Ron Caston and John Baston with Gareth Evans drafting. We always had Aboriginal people at the table on these issues with us. That was my view. You couldn't have them outside waiting and you're inside drawing the things. And so their lawyers were there as well. We'd have got more amendments up, but bloody Harradine folded and we haven't really been able to revisit it since. Gunner and Cabillo, they lost their case in court, but what a farce that the government spent $9.8 million to deny them in terms of their stolen generation stuff. Now, Beazley moved a motion in '97, which I seconded, on the apology when we were in opposition, and what he had in there, because he understood, he read the Bringing Them Home report, he put reparations in the motion as well. Sadly, Kevin did a great apology, but reparations were nowhere to be seen. And reparations can involve counselling and a whole range of other things. It doesn't necessarily have cash money. But what I'm trying to say to you is you've got to get into your leaders in a gentle sort of way, and each new one has to be brought up to speed. You can't just turn around and say, oh, look, this bloke's new, he's okay. Anyone new is never that okay unless they've got the long history. But they need to be massaged because their hearts are in the right place. And I found immense stuff. The preamble in '99 was defeated. I was the only federal Labor politician that spoke out against it because I just didn't think Howard deserved a preamble that wasn't really an Aboriginal preamble. And the interesting thing is, how smart are the electorate? 39% vote the preamble got. The Republic got 46% of the vote. And yet both sides were supposedly supporting the preamble. So the electorate's not stupid if you have the message and know how to communicate with them. The walk for reconciliation was my highlight, and I'll finish on the fact that just because you get involved in Aboriginal politics and arguing, it doesn't mean it's going to be an electoral suicide for you. After Wick, the then opposition had to lead 31 over Labor to 28. When I resigned, it was 40 to Labor and 23. There'd been a 20% poll turnaround because we consistently kept taking the arguments up. And the interesting thing is, when Kevin did the right thing on the apology, the highest recorded vote, 49 to 20 for the Libs in terms of Labor being best able to handle these issues. So look, to me it was a great experience, but it's not one that I could have achieved without the likes of Marcia and others as well, many others, meeting them on the way and being part of a coalition that says, this is wrong, it's got to be righted.